All right, so if you were to compile a list of the most popular rock songs of the last 60 years, you would find that the overwhelming majority of those songs were written and recorded using either Gibson or Fender guitars. It's undeniable, and no other guitar brand even comes close. That's not even mentioning all of the absolutely legendary players that come to mind when we think about Gibson or Fender guitars. The effect that these two giants have had on rock, blues, R&B, country, it's undeniable. So let's take an abbreviated look at the beginnings of both of these guitar companies. So Gibson was founded in 1902 by Orville Gibson, who was primarily a mandolin builder. The first technically electric guitar, at least in the way we know it, was the Gibson ES 150. ES stands for electric Spanish, which just simply means the guitar is played upright in your lap versus laying flat like a lap steel. And that was in 1935, but it was a long way from the electric guitar we know today. The Gibson guitars we most associate with rock and popular music began being produced in the mid-50s as the Les Paul model. And I would venture to say that the 1954 gold top Les Pauls were the ones that started the ball rolling for Gibson. Certainly the ES 175, as well as other Gibson archtop models, were already well-established favorites in the jazz guitar world, but Gibson's endeavors into the rock world really began in earnest with the Les Paul, most notably the coveted 57 through 60 era. Fender guitars began 44 years later in 1946 as primarily an amplifier and lap steel company, which grew from Leo Fender's humble beginnings as an electronics repair guy. It is accurate to say that Leo was the first to create a mass-produced solid-body electric guitar, the Broadcaster, which briefly became the Nocaster due to Gretsch having a patent on the Broadcaster name, and finally settling on the instantly recognizable Telecaster name. In 1954, Leo would ultimately invent the Stratocaster, which is synonymous with what almost everyone thinks of when you mention electric guitar. It is fair to say that it would be an epic battle to try to pick a winner between the Les Paul and Stratocaster when it comes to which has had the greatest impact on early rock music. All right, so what is the Gibson sound? Well, for me, I think there's always this richness and boldness and this mid-focus that's really pleasant. And I think that has a lot to do with the mahogany body design. And there's a sweet top end, especially on the Les Pauls, and I think that really has to do with the maple caps that they put on those mahogany bodies. And in terms of pickups, the PAF, that mythical PAF tone, is just a sound that so many have searched for and tried to replicate over the years. It's just this really open, uncompressed, chimey, sparkly, wonderful, kind of lightly mid-focused sound that, when you hear it, it's undeniable how good it really is. So let's take a listen to a few examples that I've recorded over the years using Gibson guitars and get an idea of some of these sounds. All right, and in contrast, the Fender sound. What is the Fender sound? Well, to me, the Fender sound is always brighter. It's more mid-scooped typically. It's a little thinner sounding, not as thick and woolly as sometimes the Gibson sound could be. The Telecaster, of course, started everything for Leo Fender, and that guitar was hugely popular in Western swing music that Leo was a huge fan of, and ultimately became the darling of country music as it's graced a million country hits over the years. That biting, twangy sound is just synonymous with country. The Stratocaster, I think, arguably you could say is maybe the most famous electric guitar ever. And if you're just out and about and mention electric guitar, even to non-guitar players, they are probably envisioning the Stratocaster design in their heads when you say electric guitar. Again, probably the most famous guitar, and I think you could almost hang that statement on Hendrix alone. The Jaguar and Jazzmaster offset guitars both had their share of great use over the years by a lot of legendary players also. So let's take a listen to a few examples of the Fender sound. All right, and for a little bit of fun, now that we live in this AI-driven world, I asked ChatGPT to make me a list of the 20 most famous rock songs ever written and the 20 most famous rock guitarists of all time. Now, this list certainly will have names that are familiar to you. There's going to be no surprises. There will certainly be some guitarists that you feel were left off the list, and it's pretty hard to compile down to 20 anyway. But for fun, we're going to go through this list. And really, this is just to prove the point that I've been making, that Gibson and Fender have always dominated electric guitar-based popular music. So let's go through this list. Number one on the list is Jimi Hendrix, who was a notable Fender and Gibson user. Same for Eric Clapton, notable Fender and Gibson user. As is the case with the third on the list, Jimmy Page. Made good use of both Fenders and Gibsons. B.B. King, Gibson. Eddie Van Halen. Now, there is some association with Gibson. We could say we've seen him with pictures of 335s and other Gibson guitars. But we're going to leave Eddie as not Gibson or Fender, strictly because we know him from the striped guitars that he made himself from parts, and later his association with Ernie Ball Music Man and PV with the Wolfgang guitars, which ultimately led to EVH guitars proper as we know it today. Carlos Santana had early association with Gibson, though we can say that typically now we associate him with PRS. Stevie Ray Vaughan, obviously Fender. David Gilmour, both Fender and Gibson. Keith Richards has played a lot of brands, but primarily Fenders and Gibsons over the years. Angus Young, obviously Gibson. George Harrison has had a strong association with both Fender and Gibson. In the early days, we may look more to Gretsch, but I think as time went on, we saw him play a lot more Fender and Gibson guitars. Richie Blackmore, obviously Fender. Jeff Beck, both Fender and Gibson. Tony Iommi, obviously the Gibson SG, which ironically his most famous guitars were not made by Gibson, but they still are SG guitars in all sense of the word. Mark Knopfler, again, both Fender and Gibson. Brian May is associated with his own handmade guitar. I'm sure he's played other things over the years, but that's really what we know him for. So he's not going to be a Fender or Gibson name in association. Dwayne Allman, obviously Gibson. You know, Dickie Betts, same thing you could say for. They are synonymous with Gibson guitars. Pete Townsend, lots and lots of Fenders and Gibsons. And Billy Gibbons, mostly Fender. We know him for Pearly Gates, which is the most famous guitar that we would associate Billy with, but also a lot of Fenders as well. All right, so let's move on to our list of the 20 most famous rock songs ever recorded. And talk about the guitars used on those recordings. Now, none of these songs are going to surprise you that they're on the list. There may be songs that come to mind that you think should have been on the list that are not, but ultimately, these songs fall right in line with what you would expect to hear. So let's talk about this list. Number 1, Stairway to Heaven, Led Zeppelin. Jimmy Page famously recorded one of the most iconic guitar solos of all time, not on the Les Paul that we may now know him for the most, but on a Telecaster. Hotel California, same thing. Joe Walsh recorded that epic guitar solo on a Telecaster. Bohemian Rhapsody, Queen. Obviously, Brian played his famous guitar that he hand-built with his dad on that guitar. So that one goes against the Fender or Gibson thing. Sweet Child of Mine. Obviously, Slash is probably single-handedly responsible for reviving the Les Paul in the 80s when the pointy headstocks were all the rage. Slash came on the scene and made everybody go, wow, the Les Paul is really cool. Now, ironically, the Appetite for Destruction guitar that he used for all the recordings was actually not made by Gibson, but it was a replica built like a 59 spec Les Paul. But in all ways, the construction of the guitar and the tone is Les Paul through and through. And Slash is obviously now the brand ambassador for Gibson and incredibly associated with the Les Paul. So we're definitely going to say Les Paul there. Don't Stop Believin'. Neil Schon recorded that on a Les Paul Deluxe, if I'm not mistaken, but definitely a Les Paul of some sort. Back in Black, obviously Angus was using SGs, always has, always will. Born to Run, Bruce Springsteen, recorded on a Telecaster. Paint It Black, Rolling Stones, Telecaster. Wish You Were Here, Pink Floyd, Strat. More Than a Feeling, Boston, obviously Les Paul. Smoke on the Water, Deep Purple, Stratocaster. You Shook Me All Night Long, AC/DC makes the list again, and obviously Angus with the SG. Living on a Prayer, Bon Jovi, Super Strat. Crazy Train, Ozzy Osbourne, Randy Rhoads, obviously on the Les Paul, or maybe a Flying V, but probably the Les Paul. Come Together, Beatles, Les Paul. Iron Man, Black Sabbath, SG. Freebird, Leonard Skinner, SG and Firebird on that track. Jesse's Girl, Rick Springfield, kind of a weird one. That's an outlier for me, but hey, nonetheless, still recorded on an SG. All Along the Watchtower, Jimi Hendrix. That session was captured in photography, and we see Jimmy with a Flying V, which very well could be the case. But in any event, it was going to have been recorded on either a Gibson or a Fender, obviously. And Ramble On, Led Zeppelin, was actually recorded with a Les Paul. So those are the 20, and as you can see, overwhelmingly, it was Gibson and Fender almost exclusively on all of those legendary songs. All right, so there you have it. And I think it's undeniable that Gibson and Fender have absolutely dominated popular music in all genres since its inception over the last 7 decades. No other guitar manufacturer has ever even come close. So, what do you think about all this? Are you a Gibson fan? Are you a Fender fan? What models are your favorites of these guitars? Let's have some discussion about all of this in the comments below. And listen, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do that right now. It would mean so much to me. And click the bell icon so you know when I produce new videos. As always, thank you for taking this journey with me, and I look forward to having some spirited conversations in the comments below. So let me know what you're thinking about all this.